The city lived in perpetual shadow. Shadows that were cast not only by the buildings, but also by the people, anyone who was willing to give in to cruelty and fear. The gray dust rising from the sidewalk seemed to hold the shadows of those who had once been here but had vanished, dissolved into this chaotic void. The ominous silence, broken only by the roars of sirens and the echoes of footsteps, broke the illusion of peace that the night darkness sometimes tried to impose. A threat hung in the air. This city had long since been ruled by no one. It had become an arena where only the strongest survived, where pain and humiliation were everyday occurrences and laws were mere mirages. Under the yellow lights of cracked advertising signs stretched tired, angry faces, looking for something, anything. They avoided each other's gazes, because they knew that in this world everyone lives at the expense of others. Shoulder to shoulder they walked, but there was nothing else in their hearts but fear. Police officers patrolled the streets, but they weren't here to protect. They were here to maintain an order that had long ago lost all meaning. There was no empathy in their eyes, no desire for truth. There was only cruelty and indifference. They were the faces of the law, but not of justice. In a dark corner of one of these streets stood he, a white policeman named Ben. His face, stern and scarred, reflected years of hard nights in this fight against lawlessness. There was no compassion or regret in his gaze, just a cold, indifferent attitude toward those he was supposed to protect. For him, it was just another day in this hell, where every time he went outside could be his last. His hand clutched the baton, as if that metal were the only thing still holding him up. In the back, a few houses away, an advertisement burned dimly. The lights were muted, like life itself in the city. He stepped closer to his partner, who stood at the intersection, wary of his surroundings. Both were silent, knowing there was a potential threat lurking around every corner. But today wasn't the usual patrol. They were here today for a specific reason. And then, in the midst of that gloom, as the gray day gave way to night, Ben spotted him. Tall, confident, with a chain that glinted like a headlight in a dark tunnel. It was him, Big Shaq. Contempt flashed in the cop's eyes. The rapper, with his tactless lifestyle, his chains and dirty money, who, he thought, only knew how to break the rules. There was no thought, no doubt. Ben decided this was his chance. He could show everyone that nothing goes without consequences. The ego in him surged. He walked straight toward Big Shaq, intending to punish him for this show of luxury. His hand instinctively reached for the chain. He knew that if he ripped it off, it would be a sign. A sign of his power. The sound of Ben's footsteps grew louder with each step. My ears were ringing with that anticipated victory. The world around them disappeared, leaving just the two of them. Ben was no ordinary cop. He was made by this city. A city that didn't forgive weakness. There was no mercy or kindness in his eyes, only a cold, unfeeling desire to control. He had grown up among the violent streets, where every day was a struggle for survival. There was no room for moral dilemmas in his life, there was only one law: the strong win, the weak perish. He couldn't afford to be soft. In a world where everything was subordinated to brutality, weakness was a direct threat. His every day began and ended in a struggle with those who, in his opinion, threatened order, with vagrants, with criminal elements, with those who risked to show that they were not afraid. Ben hated them all. In his world, everyone should have a place. A place for anyone who dared to step out of bounds, was doomed to punishment. He didn't believe in equality. That illusion was for those who were afraid to face the truth. His view of people was simple. Some could be allowed to breathe freely, and some should be tightly controlled. He knew that in this world there were those who were born to obey and those who must keep them in line. all Ben knew was violence. It was in his blood. His hand, always at the ready, was used to the baton. There was more justice in its cold steel than in all the legislation he had once studied. He believed that each blow he struck brought the city closer to order. Ben was convinced that only force could defeat chaos, and if someone needed to feel a sense of power, so be it. That was his credo, and he followed it without hesitation. But it wasn't that simple. In the back of his mind there was sometimes a shadow of doubt. There were times when Ben began to wonder if he was doing the right thing, acting the way he was acting. Too much blood on his hands, too many innocents he was putting at risk, whose judgment he didn't know. And yet, even as his inner voice tried to scream for justice, Ben stayed true to his path. His path was not that of a hero, but that of those who submit only to power and cruelty. Sometimes he caught himself feeling the fear that lurked behind his confidence. But to survive, to be the one who ruled this world, that fear had to be removed, hidden deep inside. So he did, turning doubt into a void where there was no room for weakness. Ben knew he wasn't loved, but that didn't matter to him. He wasn't there to be loved. His task was different. He was a symbol of order, a symbol of punishment. And perhaps more than anything else, he hated those he felt were weaker. Those who dared to do things his way, who broke the laws he himself had made up. When he took to the streets, every step he took was filled with a confidence and power that he didn't realize how destructive it was. Everything in his life was subordinated to one purpose, the maintenance of this new, rigid order. And no matter how hard he tried to justify his actions to himself, sometimes, as night fell, Ben couldn't help but think about the fact that his actions left traces. Traces that could never be erased. He knew that one day those footprints would lead him to someone he couldn't handle. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you had similar moments in your life where you've had to face cruelty or moral dilemmas? Share your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now, we continue. Big Shaq was not the man many people thought they would see. In the eyes of ordinary people, he was just another rapper with gold chains and a big name, outwardly successful, with an inner strength that was whispered about on street corners. But behind his every move, every word, every look, there was a story that had more pain and fear behind it than most people could imagine. His chain wasn't just an accessory. It was his symbol. A symbol of his survival, his struggle and his victory. The chain became part of his identity. When Big Shaq first put it on, he didn't know that it would become his personal flag, a flag of victory in a world that had been set against him from the beginning. Those gold and diamonds weren't just for the glitter to attract attention. No. To him, they were a memory of his journey, of the trials he had to go through to be where he was. Big Shaq was born in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods, where every day could be his last. His father left when he was still a child, and his mother, who had gone through many humiliations and troubles, tried to cope as best she could. She couldn't protect him from the world he found himself in. A world where skin colors determined who you could be, and if you were black, the world expected only one thing from you, submission. From the beginning, Big Shaq was put in a position where his life could be destroyed in one wrong move. In school, he was labeled by those who were good enough to work in the blacksmith shop, but not good enough to become someone of significance. Those words, those looks, they tormented him, but he knew one thing: he had to be strong to survive. With each passing year, he gained strength, but he was still the same boy burned by racism and violence. He knew that if he didn't find a way to fight this world would just swallow him up. He looked for ways to not just survive, but to prove to everyone that he was something more than they thought he was. Music became his weapon of choice. He began writing poetry, creating lyrics filled with pain and truth. Through music, he could shout out all the things that were hidden deep inside, all the feelings he held inside. But it was not only a path of liberation. It was a struggle, and every day was a test for him. At that moment, he realized that the only way to become someone of significance in this cruel world was to defeat it with his own weapons. And that's when the chain came into existence. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a sign of victory, not just over the world, but over himself. Behind every stone on that chain was a story, behind every gold link was one of those moments when he had survived, when he had risen. There was a time when he had to apologize for being who he was. A time when white stereotypes devalued every part of who he was. And despite that, he couldn't allow himself to give up. His chain was a reminder that he was able to break free after all. Every time he looked at it, he remembered his fight against systemic injustice, against the fact that the world had been set against him since the moment he was born. But no matter what happened in his life, he knew one thing: he would not be broken. No matter how many times he faced violence and racism, no matter how many times he had to prove that he was worthy of his place in this world. He was willing to do anything to survive and win. But when his gaze first met the police officer who approached him with aggression, he realized he was facing something far more dangerous than he had imagined. In that moment, he realized, it wasn't just street gangs that could destroy him. Not just systemic discrimination. The police officer representing that very system was the one who could destroy everything he had built. It was now, standing in front of this man who was ready to rip off his chain, that Big Shaq felt that his fight was not over. The chain wasn't just a thing. It was his life, his essence. And if that policeman was going to take it, he probably didn't realize that it could be the beginning of something much more dangerous for everyone. The city was neither good nor just. It was just a field for wars, where every day, every clash could be a turning point. And today was no exception. Police Officer Ben was on patrol, absorbed in his own thoughts, when his gaze caught on a figure in the distance. Amid the dark streets, illuminated by the dim lights of billboards, stood a man who stood out among the crowd. Tall, confident, with a gold chain that glittered around his neck like an invitation to trouble. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a statement. And for Ben, it was enough to make a decision. He turned sharply onto a side street, and his partner glanced away, but didn't say a word. Ben had already decided that meeting this man would not be without consequences. There was no interest or politeness in his mind. There were only the rules he had written himself. An order he intended to impose on anyone who dared to raise doubts. And that man with the chain, standing on the corner, was a clear violator. As he approached, Ben could already feel his heart beating faster and a lump in his throat. He'd seen people like this before, young people who think they can be above the system. But this was something more, something that didn't fit into his picture of the world. Disrespect. That man stood there, as if ignoring his existence, not noticing the system looming over him. Indomitable. The policeman got out of the car and approached him with a confident stride. He did not waste time with idle words. His voice was cold, without a hint of friendliness. Take off the chain. His words were as straight as hammer blows. Big Shaq looked up, not realizing at first what was happening. He clenched his jaws, but didn't say a word. Too many times he'd had to deal with this. Contempt. Disrespect. Claims from people who had no right to judge him. But he knew this was the kind of moment that always put him on edge. He should have been smarter than this, but right now his irritation was coming out more and more. Why? His voice was deep but restrained. Because you can't walk the streets with things like that, Ben answered, his fingers nervously clenched into a fist. It's out of order. I'm not going to stand and watch you flaunt your accomplishments and think you're someone special. As if those words were the signal lamp on which Ben had fixed his authority, his decision was already made. He didn't need any more explanations. He could see his victim freeze, as if this moment was inevitable. But what he didn't know was that it wasn't just a demand to remove the jewelry. It was deeper than that. It was a challenge that put the two of them on edge. Big Shaq felt his shoulders tense, and his hand, under which lurked a force ready to explode, automatically went to the chain. He realized that this could end the way all run-ins with the police in this city usually ended, in a violent way. But this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just another day. This was a moment when his life could become not only painful, but tragic. "You don't know me," Big Shaq said, his voice sharp and determined. "You have no right." But Ben didn't hear it. All he saw was a symbol, a chain. He didn't see the man in front of him. To him, he was just another Negro who didn't know his place. The policeman stepped forward again, his hand outstretched to pull the chain off Big Shaq's neck. He was sure of his victory. He was sure that this was going to end his way. At that moment, the tension reached its limit. There was a threat in the air. Everyone had their own tolerance limits, and Ben didn't know what would be the spark that would ignite the fire. But there was one thing: he couldn't figure out what was behind this man, behind his gaze, behind his behavior. At that moment, Ben didn't yet know that his actions could have not only consequences he couldn't have imagined, but events that would change his life forever. With each step Ben became more and more certain that he was right. He was a cop, and in his world that meant one thing: he was always right. No one could challenge his authority, and certainly not the man in front of him, the guy with the chain, who was trying to play up his exceptionalism. Ben saw him as just another drug dealer, just another trespasser who had come into this world only to be punished. In his eyes, Big Shaq was not a person, but an object to be dealt with as he saw fit. Nervous fingers tightened around the gold chain, and Ben tugged it toward him. He felt the metal tighten around the rapper's neck, losing all respect and humanity with each passing moment. The gesture was confirmation to him that he was right, that the power was his, and he was going to get it at any cost. The chain twitched, and at that moment Ben felt resistance. His chest clenched with excitement. He was sure that just a little more and his victim, this young man with brazen confidence, would remove the chain in submission. It was a moment of triumph. But instead, he felt the chain resist, a tug, and then another hard tug. Big Shaq, standing in front of him, clenched his teeth. His hand was already clenched into a fist, and his heart was pounding frantically. This moment was the last straw. He couldn't allow himself to give up. His chain was a part of him, it was a symbol of his survival, his fight against the world that always tried to suppress him. "You think you can order me around?" Big Shaq's voice sounded like a hoop clutching his throat. It wasn't just an answer, it was a threat. Ben didn't hear that warning. He only felt his hand pull the chain even harder. "Face it," he thought, "you've got to realize who's boss in this town." But Big Shaq wasn't going to accept it. Fire flashed in his eyes, and he felt his anger erupting. He cast one determined look at the policeman, a look that didn't bode well. The next second, as if from hell, his hand burst out. It hit the policeman right in the face, so hard that he jerked backward. Ben, stunned from the blow, lost his balance but didn't let himself fall. His jaw ached, but his pride wouldn't let him give up. He immediately regained his stance, but now his eyes burned with rage and his body was ready to retaliate. "You're going to pay for this," Ben hissed, his voice shaking with anger. He felt his stomach clench with rage, and his hand reached for the baton again, ready to strike. Ben was sure that his strength, his right to violence, was something everyone had to respect. What he didn't know was that there was more than just aggression behind this confrontation, but something much deeper. Big Shaq felt his chest begin to throb, his heart beating in unison with the rage that now filled his body. He felt the chain around his neck again, but now it wasn't just metal, it was his protection, his pride, his history. The world around them disappeared, leaving only two people, two worlds, two views of what was happening. It was a clash that couldn't end halfway. At that moment, Big Shaq realized that if he didn't do something drastic, he would lose everything. The sounds of sirens began to come from far away, but they didn't matter. Ben, in his rage, didn't notice how the atmosphere around them was changing. He didn't see more and more people gathering on the street corner, watching. This wasn't just a clash of two personalities. It was a clash of worlds, the world in which Big Shaq was trying to survive, and the world in which Ben was ready to destroy him. There was a threat in the air. Time had slowed down, and now everything was decided in a second. The moment Ben grabbed the chain, he didn't think about the consequences. He was sure of his impunity, that his every gesture was subjugating the world, that his every order was law. That chain wasn't just metal to him, it was a symbol of who he was, a symbol that he held not only power, but the truth of the world. And if this guy standing in front of him was too stupid to understand what order was, Ben was willing to teach him. With each tug, his hand became more and more brutal. Ben didn't care how it felt to Big Shaq. All that mattered to him was control. He didn't see the man in front of him, he saw an object to be subdued. There was no room for empathy in his thoughts, and when the chain snapped off the rapper's neck with a thud, Ben felt a growing confidence. He was the master of this situation. He was everything. But it wasn't that simple. The moment Ben ripped off the chain, he felt something change in Big Shaq's body. It wasn't just irritation that flashed in his eyes. It was something far more dangerous. It was not just anger, but an inner insight, when one realizes that there is no turning back. "Are you out of your mind?" Big Shaq shouted, his voice low and threatening. Ben, before he could react, felt the rapper's hand suddenly clench into a fist. The next second, like a bolt of lightning, its force struck the cop's stomach. Ben yelped in pain, his body leaned forward, and he nearly lost his balance. He looked up at Big Shaq, and his eyes no longer held the confidence he'd had a second ago. That's all changed now. Big Shaq straightened, his breathing deep and sharp and his gaze penetrating. He was no longer someone who could simply be ignored or humiliated. That chain the policeman had ripped from his neck wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of his survival in this cruel world, of his fight against a system that always tried to snuff out his fire. And now that his symbol had been ripped away, Big Shaq felt the darkness engulf his soul. He was ready to fight for what was left, for his honor, for his identity. Rage and darkness filled him inside. His body shook with rage, but it wasn't just rage. It was the realization that the world would not be any different with him. All he had to do was fight. And when the policeman raised his baton again, ready to strike, Big Shaq was no longer the man who gives up. He was a man who fights. "You don't get it, do you?" Big Shaq said, his voice restrained but threatening. "I'm not your toy." He stepped forward sharply, fists clenched, ready to face the cop. His fingers slid along the road, feeling his strength, until his gaze met Ben's eyes. Ben couldn't understand what was going on. Why isn't this guy afraid? Why isn't he giving up? Fury was growing inside Ben, but he couldn't hide what was happening to him. This wasn't just a cop doing his job. This was a struggle. This was two worlds colliding. Anxiety appeared in his eyes. He didn't know what to do with this man who wasn't just resisting. He was resisting everything. Ben took a step back, trying to regain control. His hand still held the baton, but it didn't seem so powerful now. Now he could feel all his power crumbling before his eyes. And in that moment he realized, he was not in control. He had become part of the chaos he had unleashed. Before we continue, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have you had similar moments in your life where you faced abuse or confrontation? Share your experiences, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now, we continue. This wasn't how Ben had envisioned it. He could feel it in the air as the tension he'd created himself hung between him and this guy. Big Shaq was not what he had expected to see. All this time while he'd been trying to suppress him, his every gesture and word had elicited a response that Ben couldn't understand. The powers he had counted on to win now seemed something shaky, fragile, as if everything he did was losing its significance. A kind of coldness had set in his soul, a doubt. At first Ben didn't notice his hands starting to tremble. He was convinced that he had the right to control the situation. But the moment his fingers closed on the baton again, his gaze met Big Shaq's eyes. There was no fear in those eyes. There was something more dangerous, understanding, as if the rapper saw something Ben couldn't see, wasn't capable of understanding. There was a shadow of contempt in his gaze, but not the kind of contempt he'd encountered before. It was something else, the knowledge that Ben, despite his uniform, his epaulets, and his baton, was not someone who stood tall. Ben felt insecure, and this feeling was new. It was a strange feeling that he had never experienced before. His own aggression began to feel unnatural to him, as if he had become part of something he couldn't control. Questions began to arise in his mind. Why isn't this guy afraid? Why isn't he obeying? Ben could feel this situation spiraling out of his control. Every word he spoke seemed ridiculous. Every movement seemed sinful. And, most importantly, he realized that the man he despised so much was more than just an indomitable troublemaker. As Ben watched Big Shaq, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were part of something much deeper and more horrific than he had realized. This wasn't just a clash between a cop and a criminal. This was a clash of worlds, unequal but equally destructive. At that moment, all his calm and confidence in his own power began to crumble. Are you nervous? Big Shaq said with a sneer, as if sensing that the policeman's weakness had become obvious. His words weren't just a challenge. They were a blow to Ben's heart. At that moment, the policeman felt his anger returning, but he couldn't get rid of the questions that were creeping into his mind. He thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is not the person I should be humiliating. But the pride, the hatred, all the stereotypes he'd carried within him for years wouldn't let him stop. He was raised in a world where his role was to suppress, not understand. His disdain for rappers, for those who weren't part of the system in which he himself existed, filled him like a threat. However, the more he thought about it, the stronger the discomfort became. Ben looked at Big Shaq, and in that moment his face changed slightly. There was no fear, no submission. Ben couldn't quite put his finger on what that expression was. It was the look of a man who saw and felt far more than the man who stood before him. And it made the policeman feel more vulnerable than ever. His mind was spinning with thoughts. Why isn't this guy afraid of me? Why isn't he hiding behind his chain and gold jewelry like I thought he would? There was something in his eyes that made Ben doubt his own actions, something that shattered the picture of the world he'd always been right about. There was silence between them. It wasn't an ordinary silence, but one that made my heart beat faster. The tension became unbearable. Ben felt his own breathing slowing, his hands no longer obeying him, and the voice inside him whispering, "You're wrong." Big Shaq continued to stare at him, his eyes not letting go, and Ben realized that there was more than just aggression in that gaze. It was a struggle for recognition, for justice, for a place in this world. A world where racism, violence, and prejudice rule, but this guy standing in front of him was someone who chose not to conform. And Ben realized that maybe this was the first time he was realizing the true meaning of the word system. Ben took a step back, his breathing becoming heavy. He tried to regain control, but something inside him was breaking. That look in BigShaq's eyes was still spinning in his head, not broken, not afraid, full of realization. Ben could feel his hands sweating as each step forward receded into the background, giving way to a worry he couldn't get out of his head. This guy was more than just a troublemaker. Something was wrong, but what? He turned away and took a few steps back, trying to hide from the gaze that was burning him, giving him no rest. But it wasn't saving him. Suddenly, like a lightning strike, everything fell into place. He knew that face. He knew his name. He knew who it was. Big Shaq. At that moment, Ben literally froze in place. He was Big Shaq, the famous rapper, the artist whose name was shouted on every corner. The man who knew how to survive in a world ruled by racism and violence, the man whose name had already become a symbol of resistance and victory. The seconds became as long as hours, and each moment built up like a stab to the heart. Ben felt his pride begin to melt. This wasn't just an encounter with an ordinary man. This was a clash with a symbol, a man who knew that his chain was not just an accessory, but a symbol of struggle, a sign that he had overcome all attempts to break his spirit. Panic began to fill his mind. Every word he had said earlier, every crude and aggressive attempt to humiliate this man now sounded like a sharp pain in his ears. Big Shaq. He realized that his actions could cost him more than just respect. It could ruin his entire career, his reputation, and maybe even his life. The flash of realization hit like thunder, burning away his certainty that he was right. How could I not understand? How could I not see that standing before me was a man who was known all over the world? Ben couldn't believe himself. He knew that his ruthless attitude, his contempt, his actions hadn't just offended Big Shaq, they could have been the reason the whole city, all the media, all those who look up to him, would have erupted into uproar. It was a mistake that couldn't be fixed with a simple apology. Ben felt a chill run down his back. His mind was quickly realizing that everything was about to change. Everything he had built over the years of his career, everything he had believed to be his strength, could be shattered with one move. This man wasn't just a famous artist, he was a symbol for thousands of people, those fighting for their rights in this world where racism and violence have become part of everyday reality. He didn't know what to do. There was only one word in his mind: too late. For a moment it seemed to him that the world was too quiet. Everything around him disappeared, leaving only that face, that look that kept him awake. He tried to justify that it wasn't him, that it was an unconscious action. But he knew that these were false words, because he himself realized, he could not have done this to someone else. This was the exact moment when the racism he had been living with came out. In a panic, Ben looked around, trying to find a way out, a way to get rid of this feeling of unease. But all his attempts were in vain. This was the moment when the world of his certainty collided with reality, and that collision was shattering everything. The Big Shaq standing in front of him was a man who could destroy not only his reputation, but everything he believed in. In that moment, he realized that he could lose not only his job, but also his respect. Everything he had once considered important was now in jeopardy. The question he couldn't ask himself before now pierced him like a dagger: what if I was wrong? Ben stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a step forward, his fingers reaching for Big Shaq confusedly, as if he wanted to make a gesture of apology, but his hand stopped in midair. He wasn't ready. This was more than just an admission of a mistake. It was a desperate and hopeless move, an attempt to regain the control he no longer had. Look, his voice shook, the words struggling to escape his throat. I didn't want this. It was a mistake. But his words sounded hollow. In the policeman's mind the agonizing thoughts did not stop. He had not just insulted a man. He had revealed his hatred, his weakness. He saw how he was drowning in his own contempt, how his actions, his humiliation could not be erased. With every word he uttered, the situation only got worse. Big Shaq did not move. His face was stone. He looked at Ben, but there was no fear or aggression in his gaze, just the realization that this moment was inevitable. He was no longer someone to just talk to or apologize to. It was too late. You think words can fix everything? Big Shaq said, his voice quiet but intense. You just took off your chain, and I'm taking my life in front of those who are willing to humiliate me. Ben felt the ground go from under his feet. His attempts to apologize seemed pathetic, as if he were trying to build bridges on nothing again. He realized that now his actions weren't just a mistake, they were already a betrayal. It was a pain that couldn't be etched in words. Time slowed down. With each step the policeman lost more and more confidence, and with it went the possibility of changing what he had done. The question in his mind was, how many times had he already burned bridges and now he was trying to rebuild them? But in this city, in this cruel world, it was too late. Ben stood in front of Big Shaq, feeling the words he wanted to say sticking in his throat. He tried to justify himself, trying to find some explanation for his actions, but the more he spoke, the clearer it became. He couldn't take back what had already been done. This moment, this encounter, had already turned into a nightmare, and no matter how many apologies he uttered, it wouldn't go away. All he felt was emptiness. But at that moment, just as Ben was about to take one last step toward redemption to make up for his act in some way, something happened that turned everything upside down. Big Shaq looked at him, and suddenly something in his face changed. He became serious, almost dangerous, as if he were holding back some force inside him that was now ready to burst out. It was a look that made Ben feel real fear. He stood there, not knowing what was happening, and with every word Big Shaq spoke, the situation only got worse. You think it's going to end here? Big Shaq said, his voice as cold as ice. You think I'm just here to make you feel sorry for me? You're wrong. The rapper's words pierced the air like a knife. Ben tried to say something, but he was interrupted. He felt his breathing become labored. He didn't even notice as the world around him began to blur. His mind whirled with thoughts that something far more sinister lurked behind this man than he could have imagined. Big Shaq raised his hand, his gaze so determined that Ben felt his legs begin to shake. In that moment, everything became clear. You don't realize who I am. You don't realize that behind me are thousands who have lived what I've lived. And not just survived. Fought. The words weren't just an accusation. It was a judgment. And right there in the background of those words, Ben realized that everything he'd thought about Big Shaq was a lie. The rapper wasn't who they thought he was. He was so much more than just a symbol. His music wasn't just a way to express pain and anger. He was part of a much bigger picture, a picture where his struggles and his messages meant more than just stages and crowds of fans. It was a rebellion against the system. This whole scene, this whole situation was set up for Ben to realize his mistake. Ben suddenly realized that behind his every move was not only his contempt and hatred for people like Big Shaq, but a far more evil force. The policeman was on the verge of being crushed by the system he himself had upheld. His entire inner world collapsed, and he realized that his actions were not just a personal mistake. It was the mistake of the entire system he was protecting, oblivious to the reality that everyone who did not belong to normal society lived in. In that moment, everything changed. Big Shaq continued to speak, but the words were no longer reaching Ben. He was in shock, realizing that not only his career, but his entire life would now be entangled in this web of lies and racism that he himself supported. The rapper was not someone who was broken. On the contrary, he was someone who was exposed. The situation was out of control, and Ben realized that now he was going to have to pay not only for his actions, but also for his role in this cruel, unfair world. Before we wrap up this story, write in the comments what you think about what is happening. Have you experienced racism or moments of inequality in your life? Your opinion is very important to us. We value each and every one of you. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. Wishing you a good day and let this moment stay with you. Write a phrase on the topic so we know you are listening until the end.